Our next presentation is going to involve two individuals. In part, it's going to be addressing actual forest revegetation, climate change, and model shifts and risk management in decision making as to what to do when a large, intense wildfire has come through an area. And over most of that area, there's been no regeneration of conifers, creating this kind of truncated successional situation, which must be dealt with. And in dealing with this, right now it's a dilemma for parks because it's counter to our principles on ecosystem management. We normally would let things come back on their own and let the successional stages and the species dependent on each stage persist. But seeing this truncated succession where the park is primarily dominated by ceanothus and some other shrubs, we think we're going to have to take some action. This hasn't been decided yet by the director, but it's looking like we will be taking some action. It's going to be actually revegetating with some conifers and looking at climate change and shifts in ranges of key species. Our first speaker is Mike Wells. Mike Wells is the superintendent of Colorado Desert area, including Anza Borrega and Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. Mike has a PhD in fire ecology and has very long history of prescribed burning, in part to reduce the effects of large fires like which swept through San Diego County 4 years ago. Mike, I've probably said a number of things that you were going to say, but better cut me off now and come on up and deliver it for us. And then Mike will be followed by Lydia Ries, who's a postdoctorate researcher at the Bren Environmental School of Santa Barbara. Lydia works with Lee Hanna, who might still be here. He had to return for class, and Frank Davis. And you saw Lydia's name and some of the work that Victoria Sork presented. We'll start with Mike.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be before such a distinguished audience. I think I'm going to need a little help to get my slides up here. And just a little clarification on the title. Reforestation refers to what our objective is with this particular project, and risk management is the technique that we're applying to try to develop an effective strategy to realize that. And this is a map of San Diego County, and this is Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, and the large polygons that you see are the outlines of fires that burned in the years 2002 and 2003. And I think it was Mark this morning that mentioned that climate change would probably influence the local fire regimes in California, and I would say, to mirror the remarks of other people, that I think that's already happened. If you think about it, of the 7 largest fires that have occurred in California history, 5 of those have occurred since 2002, so we're really dealing with a different fire regime now, and it's one of large fires that burn at extremely high intensity. Now, the total acreage burned in the Cedar Fire of October 2003, there was about 280,000 acres, about 24,000 acres of it was in Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, and that affected about 17,000 acres of woodland and forest within the park. The thing that really distinguishes the Cedar Fire and many of the other large mega fires that we've had in the last 5 years is the intensity at which they burn. This is a picture of the Cedar Fires that burned into the western edge of Cuyamaca Rancho State Park in the vicinity of Middle Peak. The fire burned so hot that actually the organic matter on the forest floor was gone right down to the mineral soil. And another thing that kind of gives you a clue about the intensity is that you don't see any lateral branches on these trees. They've all burned off. It was so hot that actually the granite boulders within the park spalled, meaning that they exfoliated their outer layers, things I've only seen a couple times before, and usually in very specific locations, never over a very large area. Some trees that were several hundred years old and had obvious fire scars and had probably survived several other cycles of fire didn't make it through this one. And this was the landscape that we were left with. And the thing that's unique about this as a post-fire landscape is its homogeneity, that you don't see much variation over it. Usually following a fire, you'll have areas that burned quite intensely that would look like this. You'll have other areas that were understory burns, perhaps on counterfacing slopes or that burned during cooler conditions. And then you'll even have some areas that don't burn at all. And the value of these areas that were either lightly burned or not burned at all is that they serve as refugia for plant and animal species, and that then can disperse out into the other areas of the forest and help aid in forest recovery. This is an aerial photo, and if you look, the yellow triangle is the summit of Middle Peak at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. The large body of water is Lake Cuyamaca, which is operated by the Helix Water District. This is that same scene after the fire in near infrared, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of canopy left. And, whoops. And this area is actually a stand of interior live oak down by a former Boy Scout camp, where there, probably generations of Boy Scouts building fires had reduced fuel loads. But the areas that you see up here, the light pink represents canopy that's been scorched and probably will die. The bright pink are things that are still alive. So there's not a lot of living things here within the boundary of the park. This is a similar view of Cuyamaca Peak, and following the fire. And I'm showing this because this is one of the few areas where we did get a fairly large patch of lightly burned vegetation. And the reason why is that the fire actually burned over the ridge that leads to the peak at about 2 a.m. in the morning after whatever humidity recovery had taken place. And so the intensity moderated, and it actually was an understory burn in that area. That entire area burned, and actually, again, these areas that are sort of light pink are probably areas where the canopy's been scorched and those trees will not survive. But it did leave some areas of bright pink where there are some surviving trees. Okay, this is a little bit of some of my own research. I did part of my dissertation project at Cuyamaca, and I was looking at coulter pine distributions and stand structure, the reason being that coulter pines sort of define the lower elevational boundary of the mixed evergreen forest at Cuyamaca. And I had 6 quarter-hectare plots located in that area on Airplane and West Mesa. And it was kind of a catharsis when I came up and saw it afterwards, because there was nearly complete mortality of 628 adult trees that were existing on the stand before the fire. There were only 3 surviving trees, and I don't mean 300, I mean 3, 1, 2, 3. And this is historically a very unusual event. In the research I did on the plots, I identified 5 different fire events that affected those plots through the course of the 20th century. And never in any instance did one of those 5 fires completely extirpate the population of trees on that plot. And in this particular instance, it did it on 5 of 6 plots. The other thing that was disturbing is the fire burned at such intensity that it was very difficult to find pine cones. And coulter pines are serotinous pines, and they do reserve some seed in their cones that remain on the tree after initial dispersal. And those cones didn't survive, and in the first spring following the fire, there was no seedling recruitment as well. Janet Franklin, a professor of biology at San Diego State University, was contracted to survey West Mesa at Cuyamaca, and it was an area that had been surveyed by a graduate student named Doug Crofton in 1995. And in reviewing his plots, she found about 90% conifer mortality. Now, this was an area where there's very little slope, and so fire intensity was quite a bit less, and moderate oak mortality of about 31%. But I will say this, that they counted a surviving oak, for instance, oaks like black oaks, where the entire upper aground bole and shoots of the tree burned down to ground level and then resprouted afterwards, and it's very difficult to tell how many of those actually would survive. Initially, in surveying the plots, she found, or her students found, no recruitment in terms of conifer seedlings the first year. The second and third year, they expanded their search to cover the whole mesa, and they found a total of maybe a few hundred seedlings. Now, seedlings are one thing, seedlings that grow into saplings are another. That usually the largest class of mortality occurs between the first and second year. And also, West Mesa probably supported a tree population of several 100,000 individuals, so a few hundred isn't very significant recruitment. And we've also contracted for a more complete survey that will look at, stratify the park by elevation, soil type, and fire intensity, and then do a random sampling design within that area. The probable or possible successional trajectory for that area is, well, what we're actually seeing is the recruitment of chaparral shrubs, largely Ceanothus leucodermis and Ceanothus gregii. They're obligate sprouting species that tend to be short-lived. They live about 40 years and then fade out. And typically, they're replaced two ways. One way, in areas where coulter pines grow around that sort of lower ecotone between conifer forest and chaparral, is that you'll see that original replacement by Ceanothus, but then within 5 to 7 years, you'll see small conifers coming up through them, and within about 10 or 12 years, they start to shade out the Ceanothus, and the Ceanothus, which matures early and produces seed, then fades out of the mix, and it becomes a conifer forest until the next fire cycle. In the absence of pines being there, generally what happens is that obligate sprouting chaparral species who have seeds that disperse very well, that have high vigility, will seed into the gaps in the canopy and over time replace the Ceanothus. And so what we're expecting to see in this area is a type conversion either to sort of an oak savanna / chaparral environment. And this would be a great loss for a number of reasons. One is that the mixed conifer forest in San Diego County doesn't have a large aerial distribution. But what it does do is it makes significant contributions to regional biodiversity because there are many species that within San Diego County are endemic to this type of habitat. But also there are the obvious implications for carbon sequestration. I know that there's some people in this room that are interested in that. And I think, whoops, wrong button again. And I think the bottom line here is that if you look at a Ceanothus chaparral ecosystem and the amount of biomass per hectare, and then look at the amount in a mixed Sierra and evergreen forest, you can see that there's about a significant difference between the two. Okay, a possible restoration strategy. The idea would be essentially to establish planted patches that would mimic those refugia that you usually find in a post-fire landscape. And try to locate those patches in the areas that would be most resilient to what we expect as the coming climate change, probably those areas that have high soil moisture conditions, say high elevation areas on the northeast sides of northeast exposures of slopes. And to plant shade-intolerant species that are native to the area. And why shade-intolerant species is because seedlings can't get established in the understory, they tend to grow at a lesser density, and because of that are more resilient to drying and also to fire. And the initial planting density and subsequent thinning would be designed to create well-spaced, fast-growing trees. Okay, this is the risk management part of it, and essentially this technique is that you try to identify the major risks to your project and then design aspects or include aspects of design in the final project that address those. So the major ones that we identified for this particular project are a dry year that causes failure of the initial planting, a climate that becomes drier, reducing suitable habitat. Another fire occurs before the trees reach reproductive maturity so that your initial efforts are wasted. A genetic bottleneck reduces reproductive viability because you're going from a situation where you had hundreds of thousands of trees to maybe just a few hundred or a few thousand, and depending on where those and how those are collected, it may be a population that has limited genetic variability. And then a climate or ecosystem change that goes in an unanticipated direction, which is always sort of the question mark. Okay, mitigations for climate. And again, that's a dry year causing a failure of initial planting, or the climate becomes drier, reducing suitable habitat. And the ways that you could help to account for that would be to plant in the most favorable locations, do site preparation, including suppression of competition and irrigation, spread planting over several years. In climate, good years and bad years are temporal events, and so you need to have some temporal variation or temporal redundancy in order to account for that. Also plant in multiple locations to make up for things that are sort of location-based phenomena. Collect seed from more xeric local sources so that you're taking seed from habitats that are drier than the habitat that you're planting into, so that if the climate does indeed become warmer and drier, you can compensate for that. And model climate change and species and ecosystem response to that change. Okay, the risk mitigation for fire, and again, a fire occurs before the trees reach reproductive maturity, is, again, plant in multiple locations so that you have spatial redundancy, because fires are sort of spatial phenomena. Manage local fuels until canopy is established or trees reach reproductive maturity, meaning that you do fuel modification to protect those stands until the stands, again, establish a canopy that will inhibit the growth of other plants or shrubs in the understory, or protect them until they reach reproductive maturity. And then thin shade tolerant species that occur in the forest understory. These are plants that can grow in the shading of the understory, and so reduce fuels underneath the trees. Genetics, again, because you're reducing a population, the chance you will be passing through genetic bottleneck. So ensure that seed sources have sufficient variability. Make the initial planting large enough so that the resulting population is genetically viable. Monitor rates of survival and consider supplemental planting if the population drops below a threshold level. And then to risk the mitigations for unanticipated change. And that would be the climate or ecosystem changing in an unanticipated direction, say something like the arrival of an exotic species that usurps a significant portion of the habitat. And of course, it's important to monitor climate, ecosystem change, and species response so that you know if your model performance is consistent with what the predictions are, and to periodically go back and reevaluate those assumptions on which your model is based. And be committed to taking a reiterative, adaptive management approach so that if monitoring and modeling indicate that you're not perhaps heading in a productive direction, that you have the ability to change direction. And I'll use that as a lead into Lydia's discussion of modeling.
Okay, great. Thank you. And that was a great lead into what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'd like everyone to just think back on kind of the morning session when Ruth Coleman and Mark Hashofsky gave a great introduction and kind of plea to scientists for informed decision tools and to try to bridge the gap between scientists and policymakers. And so I'm going to try to do a little bit of that today just by presenting one tool that we've been working on and developed that hopefully could be used by decision makers and managers in the future. Let's see. Okay, the work that I've been doing at UC Santa Barbara has been a part of a larger project by the California Energy Commission and the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara, and it's a large-scale dynamic species modeling project that is primarily aimed to assess climate change impacts on California biodiversity, specifically to estimate changes in the potential and realized niches for individual species under different climate change scenarios, as we've heard discussed today. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the static species distribution modeling that we've been doing for the past several years, and give a couple of examples for San Diego County and in the Cuyamaca area. And then also talk about this, this other tool that we've developed, which is more of a dynamic species modeling, which can be used to assess these changes in niches under climate change. So we have already heard a lot of talk about the importance of individual species, so I probably don't need to reiterate this too much, but there has been previous work on bioclimatic envelopes, predicting where we might find species given certain temperatures and precipitation ranges, and that has given us a lot of good ideas where we could possibly find species in the future. However, we must consider what could happen if these plant communities start to disassociate. So we have one species moving at a specific rate in a northern region, another species moving at a slower rate. And so these communities that we see now, these mixed conifers or oak savannas, could possibly disassociate. So we have to ask ourselves, how do species behave individually in the context of competition and different dispersal mechanisms, as well as disturbance? The species distribution modeling that we have been using is based on first building and validating individual species model based on the availability of presence data. This is in turn reduce the uncertainty through different statistical approaches, and then we're able to use these to predict future niches using different global circulation models, such as I think Hadley and Canadian, which I'll show today, and different emission scenarios such as A2 and B2. I'm going to try not to talk about too much statistics, since I fear losing some of you late in the afternoon, but just briefly, so as I said, we select species based on the availability of their presence data and some environmental data, including climate and soil data. I'll show another slide in a minute. And so we use this to build and validate models using several statistical approaches, and then with the Bayesian approach, incorporate the soil and climate data. These models are then projected to future environments based on these different scenarios from the IPCC, and then optimize model outputs through principal components analysis. And then, of course, ultimately, we can estimate the change in range between our present projections and those for the years 2050 and 2080. And we ultimately are interested in doing this at a decadal time step to get more of a finer scale temporally, but right now we're just doing up to 2050 and 2080. And so I mentioned some of these environmental variables that we're using to define these bioclimatic envelopes, such as the climate data, and there's a whole range of different variables we could look at. We've just selected these for the species that we're interested in because they will most likely have the largest impact. So maximum in temperatures, annual temperature ranges, different precipitation characteristics, and of course different soil characteristics, soil depth, pH, salinity, and water table. And these should look familiar. You've seen a couple of these in some of the slides or talks so far. These are just the general distribution models. I'm going to show you a couple conifer species. And for all of these, the format will be generally the same. The lighter colors are low probability of occurrence, and then darker colors are higher probability. So this is just a general output for Jeffrey's pine. And on the left is present projections that we've come up with and future projections. So you can see that in the northern Sierra, we're actually gaining some of the habitat probability, and in the southern portion, we're also gaining. This is compared to the present projections, and in the southern portion, in the transverse area, transverse range, we're seeing a loss. And this is coulter pine. And again, we're seeing some changes up here in the central and northern Sierra, and a loss. Oops. Quercus agrifolia, we've already heard some talks about oaks today. Just to reiterate some of these changes, down in the southern portion, we're losing much of the range. And I'm going to show some zoomed-in shots for San Diego County in a minute, so we'll be able to get a closer look. And some ceanothus species. The southern region, you see kind of a general shift up the coast and a general expansion in some of the northern central areas. So to date, we've done this for 314 species, which cover lots of different habitats: Mojave, mixed conifer, coastal scrub areas. And this, of the 314 species, 89 are California endemics, and the rest of them include those that are found in Baja and some of western Nevada and Southern California. So if we compile all of these species that we've looked at so far, we're able to generate a projection of endemic richness, of course, for those 89 endemic species. So this is what we've projected for currently, and then also for 2050. And one thing to note is this, I think we've already seen similar patterns so far in some of the talks, but a major loss of endemism down here in the transverse range area, and also in this portion here. I should emphasize, sorry, the red is areas of high endemism, and the lighter colors are lower endemic richness. Okay, now that I've talked about the species, static species distribution modeling, just gonna talk about some of those same results, but in the context of San Diego County and the Cuyamaca area that we just heard about. So Mike gave a great overview, much better than I could give, of the cedar burn. And so generally, they've just seen a major suppression in pine recruitment and a much greater distribution of ceanothus in this region. I guess it's a little bit hard to see, but there is an outline here in pink of Cuyamaca and some of the other state lands. It's not really showing up too well. Hopefully you can see it better here. So here's Cuyamaca, and this is the static distribution for Jeffrey's pine. And so now I'm just going to flip-flop back and forth between present and then projected 2080 for a couple of species. And I'll go back a couple times. It's a little easier to see the differences. So this is present, and then Jeffrey's pine. So you see that we're losing much of that in the Cuyamaca area. So again, that's present and then 2080. And for coulter pine, present and 2080. And you can see the effects of projected increasing moisture in the eastern part of the counties, but that's still, as far as ecological projections, that's still a relatively low probability of actually finding this species there. So this can be a little misleading, but the areas that we see, we see a lot of change. Areas in this area up here. And Quercus agrifolia, again, here's present and 2080. And for the ceanothus species, see a general shift eastward or westward. So that's present and 2080. Okay, now I'm going to go into some of the dynamic species modeling. So we have all of these great bioclimatic envelopes and species distribution models But what about dispersal? So just because we say that these species could exist given the right climatic and soil conditions, does it actually mean that they could get there or will get there under climate change? So we have to consider their dispersal abilities, both short and long distance events. And we have to consider the competition with other species and plant functional types. So an area that might be suitable for blue oak in the future may already have a pine community there. And so we have to consider what type of competition they would both experience and who would outcompete the other. And of course, we have to consider fire, as we've seen today, and other disturbances such as grazing and different land uses. So to help answer some of these questions, we've developed a tool, BioMove, which is a dynamic species modeling approach. And it's a spatially explicit model used to predict the movement of individual species. It simulates dispersal, competition, and disturbance, and it's on a 1 kilometer scale. It can be used to predict the movement of species, of course, which has implications for management strategies, habitat suitability for other species that are dependent on these vegetation types, and the development of conservation areas. This is just a screenshot of the model, and I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of it too much, but just to give you an idea of how it functions, the basic premise of it is that we pick a target species such as blue oak and then run it in competition with the plant functional type that it might encounter in its habitat. And so both the target species and the plant functional type are characterized by some of these different submodules that you see here. So demography, we can assign different age class limits and mortality rates. We can also characterize the disturbance regime, so we can add in different fire submodules, as well as different dispersal mechanisms. And this is just an example of a type of output that we could get. This is sugar pine, and I'm not going to go into too much about some of the differences that we're seeing, but just to show you some of the things that we're can come up with. Oops. To orient you, this is in the Sierra, and this is Lake Tahoe here. So on the left is the basic envelope, which is kind of your input for the model. So this is the static distributions that I was talking about in the beginning. And then after we run this in competition with the other target species, we can come up with distribution individuals for different age class. I think this is different age classes. So we have mature, senescent, seedlings, and immature individuals. And so this was projected for 2010, 2050, and 2080. So in addition to just kind of the baseline model product, we are interested in incorporating and developing further some of the disturbances such as fire, because we have seen recently that is playing such an important role in climate change and reforestation. So we've developed a 54-year fire industry history from the FRAP website, and divided this into 4 size classes for fires and figured out how these different size classes correspond to the different functional types that we're interested in. And so this, of course, will vary between your target species. Also, I'm interested in incorporating land use change submodule. This is something that we haven't done thus far, but looking at how public and private lands and management strategies could affect dispersal and competition of some of these species. And so just to kind of think about some of these different applications, the Cuyamaca Rancho State Park area is fairly new to me, and so just starting to brainstorm some of the potential applications and collaborations with the dynamic species model. So hopefully we could be able to predict and answer some of the questions that Mike had generated. Basically, what species want to go in which direction? What can we predict that we would find where? How do different functional types compete with each other? What are some of the dispersal barriers around Cuyamaca that might prevent or enhance the movement of species? We've seen that there's a great database so far of different establishment of these individuals for Cuyamaca, and so this would be a perfect opportunity to validate some of our models. And of course, if we could predict the habitat suitability in Cuyamaca and the surrounding areas for other dependent species. In general, just first in summary of our work, so we've developed this library of distribution model outputs throughout the state of California, and we're in the process of coupling these outputs with spatially explicit models in order to predict climate change-driven shifts for future scenarios under different emission scenarios from the IPCC. And we will continue incorporating different competition and disturbance and hopefully land use changes into the model. And hopefully these will and could be used by different managers and conservation strategists. And I think that's it.
Any questions for Mike and Lydia, either specific to the project at Cuyamaca or the more general principles of the October? Right here, Mike?
Lydia, I was just curious. So we just saw the evolutionary hotspot presentation, and that really focused at least partially on the Tehachapi area. And your modeling seems to indicate that a lot of species that we're focusing on, for example, at parks and saving, will be moving out of the Tehachapis, or will no longer be appropriate habitat. So I'm just wondering, have you incorporated the evolutionary hotspot data, or do you plan to do that, or how do these things interface?
Yeah, we haven't incorporated anything so far, and it could be a little misleading just by the specific species that I chose. I mean, there's definitely other species that will be moving into those areas, and I thought it was interesting just based on some of Victoria's slides that the areas where she predicted high genetic diversity, we actually have predicted the same endemic richness, endemic richness in the, I guess it was kind of in the transverse range where you had some of those images, but then for 2080 we see a lot of loss of that richness. So I think it could definitely be interesting to try to incorporate some of that loss of genetic diversity into some of our similar predictions.
And so, do you think that based on your models, are you saying that there's an inevitability to this, or are you saying that things could be done in terms of reserve design to help that habitat maintain species?
Yeah, and I think that it really kind of necessitates a larger kind of examination of the specific species involved, and also, I mean, the static species will tell us, yes, the species could be there, no, it probably won't, but I think that the dynamic species modeling is really where we would get a better understanding of, is it possible that this species will get there, and if so, we do need to set up a reserve, or we do need to implement something.
Victoria?
Your talk reminded me of a question I've had for a while, and I don't know if your modeling can take this issue into account. When we think about expansion of species ranges or movement of species, we, especially woody species, we forget that there are existing trees there. And so unlike the post-glacial migration, where basically you're reinvading empty space, what you're doing is you've got a bunch of trees there or woody, species that are occupying space. They may be maladapted, but they're still holding on ground and would make it difficult for new species to move in. I don't know if your modeling can take that into account or if you thought about it at all. I don't know how to, but it is something to think about as we have climate changing environmental conditions.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we are trying to address with BioMove, just how new species might be able to have high recruitment in areas where you have established systems already, and through some of our competition sub-modules, we're hoping to address that.
Maybe we could just burn those areas, right?
Then we could start over like a new post-glacial period.
I did want to make one statement to what Mike Wells had presented on some of the mitigations that could take place in going through this revegetation effort, that a lot of that information was put together by Connie Millar, the Forest Service, and it really, what Mike was bringing forward was emphasizing resiliency, redundancy, and selection of those areas for revegetation. And the one thing that he didn't bring up that comes from some of the similar work done by the National Park Service that we all should be aware of, and that, generally that's don't sit on your hands too long, take action, and management needs to be able to give a tone of failure is okay. We'll learn from failure, but we'll never get to where we want to get unless we move forward with those type of activities. And that's what we're attempting to do at Cuyamaca. There's a number of steps that Mike is going to be going through with San Diego State and with maybe some assistance from Lydia. One of the things we want to do early is get the right group of people, and we're going to engage CAL FIRE, possibly the Forest Service, people who are really interested in these models and the recovery after a hot fire, and establishing not only just the revegetation effort, but also a number of experiments with long-term monitoring. We'll get a pretty good sense in validating the models that we invoke in the near term. So maybe some of you will be called on to give your thoughts on how to set up those experiments in the next year or two. Any final questions? One more.
Hi, Sid Brown. I'm curious, I was thinking as I was looking at the maps of species richness in the Tehachapi's and the Central Coast, and I'm a geologist, and that's the physical science and the underlying geology is something that we haven't heard a lot about. We've heard about plant and animal species, and I'm thinking from a geologic standpoint, the substrate where you have these chemical signatures in the soils that are derived from the rocks, that's where you have sedimentary rocks that have been, with topography, might be another way to cut that picture. So just a comment. And then I do have a question on the culture pine about the irrigation, how that would work.
Mike?
We don't know yet.
Okay, Ruskin.
So Ruskin Hartley with Save the Redwoods. I always had kind of one just general comment and then one specific question. And the general comment was, I think the probability range maps kind of give me a false sense of security in that there appears to be a lot of blue areas at a statewide scale. So I know that's only part of the story, but I think that those sort of maps need to be carefully described as they get taken more broadly with the public. And then maybe the question for Mike is if they're designing their restoration strategies, just the role of leaving parts of the landscape, in a sense, wild and letting those new ecosystems assemble themselves on their own, what they're doing with respect to that element.
Well, and I agree with you, Ruskin. I think that's extremely important, is to leave natural controls for anything like this. I mean, this is a manipulation of the landscape. And when we do a manipulation, I think it behooves us also to have an area that acts as a natural control. I think in this particular instance, one of the approach that we're thinking of is not going out and planting 1 million trees at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, and for a couple of reasons. One would be that in any given year, the chances of that failing would be rather high, so you could put a tremendous amount of effort into it and get no positive or just a very little result. But I think also what we're talking about is putting small patches in the landscape that during good years could act as sources of dispersal for organisms that otherwise would not be in that post-fire environment but were native to the sites before. And so if, presumably if, say, you do, say, our very worst projections for climate change take place, probably those patches would just remain until conditions changed and they failed, but they would have no, or would have little effect on the environment outside of the patches themselves.
Okay. One more question?
I was wondering, do you have resources for the restoration effort, or are you just planning how it should be done?
Well, we've been working with CAL FIRE, and they actually have been willing to commit resources, and we will probably do a pilot project this year to sort of look at basically to look at the effectiveness versus the economics of doing pre-site preparation.
Let me add to that response, too, that Ruth Coleman earlier mentioned, I think it was Ruth, $400 million from Prop 84 came to the department, and $10 million have been set aside specifically for projects like this, as well as some forest thinning in order to protect certain parks, certain areas from crown fires like took place in this area. So we expect to be able to fund a project like this in the near future.
Would this kind of project be a candidate for investment in a cap and trade system, or someone who had a cap on greenhouse gas emissions could pay for this and as an offset for not reducing their own emissions?
Do you want me to have John Nickerson?
Well, I guess the short answer would be that obviously there would be some benefits in terms of carbon sequestration if the project is successful. As to how that would be accounted for, I think somebody else could better speak to that than me.
John Nickerson? Where's John? John, can you address that? And I think it has to do with voluntary versus regulatory requirements for offsets. And could the pine restoration, fir restoration at Cuyamaca, would it have some of those benefits?
Do you hear me? Okay. I think what Mike said is true. It obviously has a benefit to the environment in terms of additional carbon stores. The current protocols would need to be adjusted before we could do this on park land. So there's a little bit of work to be done, but theoretically, it could happen.
John,
did I answer the question, Rick?
It's got a while to go, ways to go. John Nickerson and Nancy Bunch, who are both here, are under contract to Parks to explore the potential of sequestering carbon and some of the benefits that could come to help continue the restoration of the forest improvement in parks, either through a voluntary or a regulatory cap and trade situation.
Yes, so the one thing we want to start out doing is just to know what are the carbon benefits before we even think of putting it into any kind of, to try and trade and do anything else with it. We just want to know what the carbon upside is.
One of the things they're going to be doing is interesting next week is going down to Cuyamaca. You saw one of Mike's early slides of all of the burned trees. Well, they're going to be actually measuring the diameters of burned trees and the spacing of them, like in a Coulter pine situation, and try to determine how much can be expected to be sequestered over the life of a Coulter pine, as well as a Jeffrey and I guess a white fir. So, and we'll see what happens. Get some information there. Okay, well, you guys, thanks very much. That was a wonderful presentation. about 2 months ago, well, three or 4 months ago, Mike Chappell, Mike Eaton, Carol Hart, and I were trying to come up with the details of a climate change panel at the Biodiversity Council. One of the people that was helping us was David Graber, chief scientist at Sequoia Kings Canyon. And through discussions, what came out of this, a statement that he made, was related to it was an April symposium in Montana. It was the National Park Service researchers, the Forest Service, and I believe the USGS was a participant in this 2 or 3 day symposium as to what are we going to do in terms of conservation in light of climate change, at least on the federal protected areas. And one of the statements he made was we determined that we really need to do experiments that are short-term, small, concise, that can deliver results so that we can make decisions quicker. And I did ask David, well, what was the most important thing that came out of this? And he said the most important thing that came out that we can do is continue to put our efforts into large landscape reserves in California, thereby, or part of that, linking existing protected lands into a larger landscape reserve and increasing the size of those reserves. That reserve planning is really important, and clearly it puts a kind of a lid on purchasing or investing in fragments of habitat as opposed to linking existing protected areas or expanding large landscape reserves. And with that thought in mind, I called Mike White of the Conservation Biology Institute and challenged Mike to prepare a presentation based on the principles of designing a landscape reserve in light of climate change. This, to my knowledge, had not been done before, and to Mike's it hadn't been done, and he's put a lot of time into determining, what kind of messages need to be brought forward in this important area of landscape reserve planning, taking into account climate change. So with that, Mike, I hope that's what your presentation is all about.
Thank you, Rick. So at the risk of putting you all to sleep before the end of the day here, I thought it'd be appropriate before jumping into a discussion about climate change itself and the effects on how we design reserves to actually do a little Conservation Biology 101 overview. There won't be a test at the end of this, but I think it will help us sort of speak in the same language. So there are sort of conceptual models that we put together to think about things, and there is an early formulation of a landscape. When I talk about landscapes, for our purposes, these are just big areas of land. Landscapes comprised of patches of habitat that are suitable for particular species, connected by corridors, relatively narrow linear corridors that allow species to move back and forth. So some patches are isolated from others, surrounded by inhospitable matrix that is unsuitable for the species. But we know that this is a really simplistic view of the world, and that in fact landscapes exist along a continuum of structure and quality for different species, ranging from very intact wildlands. This is a photograph of the Tehachapi Mountains, which we've heard a lot about, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about, to at the other extreme, these essentially completely converted landscapes. This is an urban area of San Diego with just relics of natural vegetation left in some of these urban canyons. But we have everything in between. This is a satellite image of a piece of the El Dorado National Forest. These little speckles are clear cuts on private industrial timberland with a big fire scar here in the middle of the landscape. Species will perceive this differently than they will something like this, where there's still a significant amount of natural vegetation left, but there's a lot of houses and hardscape and things. And so this continuum of condition acts as sort of a filter as species try to move through and are supported by landscapes with possessing these different conditions. And so essentially, though, all of those different conditions, those human modifications, sort of had bad effects for natural resources. And so just generally, I'm assuming I'm sort of preaching to the choir here a little bit, but the effect of residential development in my cartoon here, or agricultural conversion, is that we lose habitat, we fragment it into smaller pieces, and by doing so, we have the potential of reducing connectivity for species that have to move between these patches by increasing the interpatch distance. And then there are what we refer to as edge effects at the edges of these patches. So we have lights and noise and exotic species, and we change moisture regimes, and all of this stuff tends to cause adverse effects at the edges of the remaining patches of habitat, to the extent that for some species, the effective habitat within that patch is actually reduced. They require these sort of core internal conditions, and for some patches, that means species are completely excluded from them. And so to counteract, realizing that there's all this bad stuff happening from human modifications, we build reserves for species. And the idea of these networks of reserves is that we really want to capture all of the biodiversity that we possibly can. And so we target large, heterogeneous landscapes, lots of structural complexity, they're connected. We really want to target intact ecosystem processes because that's often what determines the biodiversity that we see. But it's important to also recognize that under our sort of current reserve design paradigm, especially under a regulatory-driven process like an NCCP, where you've got listed species that people are seeking permits for, we're often going into relatively small fragments of habitat to pick up certain special elements. So rare plant populations that are restricted to certain soil types, small populations of listed species that are in some isolated canyon. You need to pick those up in the reserve system because a permit can't be issued unless you demonstrate that you're adequately conserving those species. And so there's been a lot of work done over the years on how one designs reserves, and that work is still going on. There's some, I'm going to paraphrase some principles that I think that people are sort of settling on generally. It's better to have species distributed well distributed across the range. This is sort of the redundancy argument that we've been looking at. We don't want all of our eggs in one basket in one place. We have disease or fire, things that extirpate them in that one place. Large blocks of habitat are better. There's diversity of conditions, heterogeneity, all that stuff. There's a lot of discussion of connectivity. We want things to be able to move around, individuals move back and forth between patches. And then one of the things I also think that's important is roadless or areas that are relatively inaccessible for people tend to have higher conservation values, resource values, habitat quality than places that are more accessible and roaded. So reserves look at places on the ground where we capture biodiversity, but it's also important to recognize the other side of this, which is management and stewardship emphasis for these areas of land. We know, and Victoria's touched on this earlier, we know that all public land is not managed for the same outcome. And so some areas, national parks, wilderness places, wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, they are prioritized for natural resource values, trying to maintain ecosystem processes and functions. There are other public lands that are managed more for multiple uses. There's extraction going on and those sorts of things that, while preventing the conversion to, say, residential or agricultural land uses, they are de-emphasizing natural resource values. And so there's this dichotomy that we have to keep in mind between highly protected areas and other public lands. So I will use this sort of terminology, I guess, in the remainder of the talk, is I refer to sort of core reserve areas. These are our highly protected land areas that are managed for natural resources values as their primary objective. We have other matrix lands around those, and those can be public and private lands outside of these core reserve areas, but they may differ in their management emphasis. Again, we can have a spectrum here, so there may be management overlays that are applied to try to buffer these core reserves or to try to link them, and then we have, at the other extreme again, areas where we've actually just converted the landscape into some sort of non-habitat type of condition. Okay, so we get to what Rick actually asked me to talk about. And so we've heard a lot about various climate change scenarios, and I think for me, when Rick asked me to think about this, I'm not sure that we really know enough at this point to be able to say, geez, here's what the reserve design should look like in 100 years. We know that things are going to change. Climate is going to change. Processes associated with that is going to change. Biology is going to change. But remember, all of these, you pick one trace of one factor, carry it through your model, and you end up with a particular scenario. We don't know which one of these scenarios is necessarily going to play out. And so what that tells me is that we're back to Conservation Biology 101. But we need to think about that in light of these changes. It's no longer can we afford to have the static view of the world that we have in the past. We have to realize that things are going to change. So, for example, we still want reserves that conserve all of the biodiversity of California. We still want to build big, large core habitat reserves. We want them to be connected. And what I'm going to stress a lot today is that the matrix lands today between the core reserves is the stuff that we have to work with in the future. And so we should keep all of our options open by protecting as much as we can that matrix land that still is relatively intact. So, for example, let's talk about biogeography. So people have shown ecoregions. So ideally we want biodiversity represented well in our reserve system throughout all of the 10 major ecoregions of California. But when we talk about biogeography, it's really organized in a hierarchy. And so within, I'm just going to use the South Coast as an example. If we look at it at a finer scale, we know again that there's this coastal plain. Those resources are different than what you find inland in the mountains. So it's in one ecoregion, but it's different from the coast to the inland areas. You can even go into a finer scale. We know that what we tend to see up on the Palomar and Cuyamacas is different than what we have up in the Santa Ynez. Ideally, we want all of this stuff into our reserve system, except that if you know Southern California, you know that what's left in a lot of this coastal plain are relatively small fragments of habitat that we seriously have to question whether they're viable under a dynamic scenario where climates change into the future. So we have to think about the size of these reserves. And so when we think about size, one way to think about that is we want, Mike has talked about this, that you need refugia where organisms can recover from disturbance events. And so in Southern California, we've had a recent taste of what disturbance events actually can look like. And these are fire perimeters for 3 major fires. Actually, Mike estimated this at 280. So 3 major fires over the last 40 years, ranging from 170,000 acres to nearly 300,000 acres. And so if you go into the literature and people start thinking about what do these disturbance events tell you about reserve size, there's suggestions that we need multiples of these. And so from 2 to 4 times this size, we're talking about, 500,000 to 1 million acres of land in a, ideally in a core reserve area. There are not many places in Southern California where you can get that any longer, particularly for these particular types of narrow bioregions. The other way we can think about this is that we know that top carnivores exert sort of top-down control over prey populations and therefore affect community structure. And so there's been a lot of work done to try to maintain sufficient acreage of habitats to support things like mountain lions. And so there's been some work that has done by Paul Byer and some others in the, this is estimates coming out of the Santa Ana Mountains. You need a 250,000 to 500,000 acres to support a viable population of mountain lions. And you can do that by protecting 500,000 acres of land in one big block, or you can have smaller patches of habitat that, again, are connected. But remember that, we have to, we've been working on connectivity in places a lot, and it's expensive. It's not always very effective, and I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. But the point of this is just that the size of these patches is really going to dictate the assemblage of species that we end up with, and there's a lot of research that's been done that's showing that losing one of these species at the top can have profound implications on the species that are remaining. Okay, so having said all of that, are there still things that we can do that make sense in light of this dynamic situation that we're presented with? And you've heard a lot about the Tehachapi Mountains. I'm going to talk about the Tejon Ranch, which straddles the Tehachapi Mountains. And let me just explain what this map is showing you. So the red color is essentially urban land cover. And so you can see, there we go. I'm losing battery power. So you can see the urban footprint of Los Angeles, here Santa Barbara, Bakersfield. This, I don't know what color that looks like to you. It was meant to be yellow, but that is agricultural land cover. This is all of the ag in the Central Valley. Here's the Sierra, the transverse range again. The darker green areas are highly protected areas. So the San Rafael Wilderness, the Carrizo Plains National Monument up into Sequoia, some of the roadless areas that are around, Condor Sanctuary. The lighter green are, again, public lands that have a lower protection status or emphasis on them. So the general national forest lands here, et cetera. So Tejon Ranch is in the purple. You can see that Tejon Ranch it's the largest contiguous private property in California. It sits at this intersection between large, intact sort of wilderness areas on either end. It sort of is this stopgap between this land cover change that's happening all around it. We've heard it's sort of important for biodiversity and lots of genetic diversity, those sorts of things. I would argue that not only is this type of conservation target makes sense, that in light of climate change, this is actually increasingly imperative that we protect this place. It allows a lot of movements across landscape scales. It has, it has the ecological processes that are intact today. We know they're going to change, but at least they can change how they're going to change. We don't have to worry about dams on them and that sort of thing. Rivers are going to flow the way they want to. So that's, this is something that we need to do. So Ruth, get your checkbook out. Okay, just another example. This is up in the northern Sierra. You can see Lake Tahoe here. Again, the same sort of scheme. This is urbanized land cover change. This is Truckee in the Martis Valley, Donner Lake. The darker green are the more highly protected areas. The couple of wildernesses here, some roadless areas along the North Fork. And there is about 10,000 acres of industrial timberland that borders the Granite Chief Wilderness that's currently under conversations for some sort of protection or some sort of a conservation transaction, perhaps. This makes a lot of sense in light of changing climates. You're buffering existing protected areas, serving to connect them to other highly protected areas. You can't lose with something like this. And so what I'm emphasizing now, I think, is that there are strategic matrix lands around these core protected areas that we need to make sure we're focusing on. And so let's talk about the matrix for a little bit. We've been doing some work with the Forest Service in the Southern Sierra. This is Sequoia, Kings National Park, and here's Yosemite, looking at habitat suitability for Pacific fisher. And so Pacific fisher is sort of a medium-bodied forest carnivore, relies on later cereal stage forests for its habitat. And so there's issues around how we manage forest land from a harvest standpoint. And there's been some litigation associated with this species down in the Southern Sierra. And so what we wanted to look at is what is the distribution of, the bigger project is what's the distribution of fisher habitat today, how might management actions affect that, but then it gives you the ability to also start asking questions about how might this habitat distribution change in the future. And so just these maps, they may be a little bit difficult to see back here, but keep in mind, these are our core protected areas, and this is really the matrix around it. And so in the next slide, the green is, I don't even understand the models that they're using to project this stuff, but they're projecting fisher habitat based on a number of variables, elevation, biomass of trees, structure of the forest. The darker green areas, in a nutshell, are the best quality fisher habitat. And what you see is that there's a lot of high quality fisher habitat that's in this matrix land. It's not just sitting in these core protected areas. And so the decisions we make about the matrix affect habitat for this species. And this is just obviously one species that we're talking about. I think the other point that you can make is, we're talking about a significant chunk of sort of latitudinal a latitudinal cline here, where if we start eliminating habitat in certain portions of the range, we've got to worry about connectivity along this latitudinal gradient. And so keep your eye on these green areas. The most suitable fisher habitat. In the next slide, what we did was look at a scenario of habitat condition by doubling fires. And so thinking about fire frequency going up with respect to climate change, what does that do to fisher habitat? And so the lighter green areas are places where the high quality fisher habitat previously did not change. The darker red is where it went down. And so notice that the areas that are really most resilient to these changes are actually outside of the national parks. It's in the matrix. And so the decisions that we make, is anybody here from the Forest Service? So there's discussions about maybe where we need timber, where do you get that from? And there's discussions about how you allocate your harvest across this public land. Those decisions, I'm not privy to, this is not my project, and I should say this is all preliminary and it's still under discussion, but there are discussions going on about how you allocate harvest in order to protect this and other species associated with these sorts of habitats. So Lydia's work is getting a lot of press today, I guess, and so this is another example looking at the changes in the future of blue oak woodland. And so just again to lay out this map, the two colors here are two modeling scenarios of Lydia's for blue oaks. I've just extracted out the sort of the highest probability out of her model results. So this color is where blue oak exists today or has the highest probability of existing today. The green is places in the foothills where the distribution of blue oaks has expanded upslope in 2080 under a very high emission scenario. And the points I want to make here, you can see in the hatched kind of overlay here, I don't know how well you can see it. These are existing public lands. Here's a couple of the wildlife areas in the field station there. This is mostly Tahoe National Forest. But we need to be thinking about, gee, in the future, you know, the blue oaks are down here, but this land may be someplace where we want to establish a new core area for blue oaks. And so keeping our options open in the future is I think what it's really all about right now. The other point I'd like to make, again, in the red here, this is urban land cover change associated with Grass Valley, Nevada City. But I don't know how you can see this, but you know, this is the creeping rural sprawl that is happening here. We have to question how well, you know, this stuff is going to move through that type of converted matrix. You know, Rick asked me to think about this, you know, what sort of residential housing density is acceptable in these areas? I can tell you that there's research that shows at very low housing densities, you have negative effects on species richness, you know, the abundance, the ratio of native to non-native species. Sensitive species start to drop out. You know, you end up with things like crows and jays that are nest predators and all of that. There are changes at very low housing densities. It's not to say that a mountain lion perhaps can't move through this stuff, but when we think about an ecosystem trying to migrate upslope, we don't know how it's going to play out. So I think, you know, I've heard a lot about connectivity today, and we have to be very clear what we mean by connectivity. We do a lot of this in Southern California now because that's all that we have the option to do. And animals, believe it or not, will go down that tunnel. But you know what? That is not the kind of connectivity that we need to be worrying about for changing ecosystems with, you know, that are just going to move all over. We don't know what is going to happen. And, you know, we're talking about, you know, it's not just individual species, which we can begin, you know, we've seen great work today. We can start to think about how a particular species might move across the landscape. We know nothing about how ecosystems are going to move around the landscape. When you talk about bacteria and fungi and inverts and all of the stuff that make up ecosystems, we don't understand it today, let alone be able to tell you what's going to happen in the future. We want to really avoid this, putting ourselves in that sort of situation. Okay, Rick mentioned fragments. This is a fragment out in southeastern San Diego County. There's the town of Alpine here. This is about a 500-acre patch of habitat called Wright's Field. It's actually decent native grassland still. It's habitat for Kino checkerspot butterfly. In fact, it's designated critical habitat for Kino checkerspot butterfly. Today, this fragment has strikes against it already. Isolated, small, surrounded by development. If we add on climate change, what we might protect today may not even be there in the future. We need to seriously consider the value of working on these types of fragmented habitats, even if they have special resources that we're interested in. And that comes back to that comment on the regulatory process. So just a couple of take-home messages. We heard some about adaptive management. We need to be managing the reserves and the matrix around them to accommodate these changes. I think one of the things that I think is super important is we need some way for agencies to work together better. I am blown away that somebody can do weed control up to their fence line, and then it's another agency on the other side, and you You just can't cross the boundary. There's folks doing, Rick mentioned, people are taking actions today to manage for climate change. We need to be able to pass that information around and learn from it. Somebody mentioned earlier, we're going to see things that we haven't seen before. We're going to see new species assemblages. I don't think we can accurately predict how all of these species are going to sort out 100 years from now as they play out with varying climate change. So my feeling is that what we really need to be able to do is to accommodate these changes in ecosystem processes to the extent that we can. We need to let these, if the changes are going to happen, yes, we need to start worrying about emissions and trying to ratchet down what those changes could be. The change is going to happen. We need to let the processes play themselves out so that the ecosystems come back into some sort of final position relative to those processes. Conservation trade-offs are real. We have limited dollars and human resources. We need to make the best use of that. We should be extremely explicit in why and where we're spending our resources. We need to keep our options open. There's a lot of great work that's being done. There's a ton of great science that's going on. We need to take advantage of all of that. And my last point is, the matrix, we should be targeting areas of matrix that they may not have any target species or target resources. If they are intact today, that to me is enough reason to be targeting those areas for protection. Thank you.
Okay, questions for Mike White? I didn't indicate Mike's from San Diego. That's where his office is located. Steve?
Mike C. Dudson from the Conservancy. Oh, there we go. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of matrix lands and their importance. We basic principles of preserved design is bigger is better, and that often including matrix lands. The problem is that when you go to the public trough to buy matrix lands, not all matrix lands are alike.
Right.
How can you and other scientists help us distinguish between valuable matrix lands and just another piece?
Well, I think somebody showed a map that Frank Davis and others that had worked on, trying to project sort of integrity of California, and it looked like it was mostly sort of a land cover change kind of analysis. We've been doing some work with Trust for Public Land up in the Sierra, trying to characterize the value of some of that private matrix land. So, I think it can be done. I know Rebecca's been working on, ecosystem services kinds of questions, and, those services and processes don't understand ownership patterns. And so I truly think that one of the things we ought to be focusing on is where are these valuable matrix lands regardless of ownership, and we need some, it's a land use question as much as anything. We ought to be taking land use authority away from some of the the unincorporated counties if they're not going to understand, that this stuff is critical to our future. So I think it can be done, Steve.
More questions?
Everybody's ready to go home?
Right here. Mike.
How do we, as a state, identify, or what's the process for us to identify the large areas that are the key parts? I mean, who is it that's going to make those kinds of decisions as opposed to those fragments that you talked about that are probably less important? How do we do that?
Somebody just needs to sit down and do it, I guess. There's different, and I don't mean that flippantly. There are different initiatives underway in different parts of the state that are looking at exactly that question. The Wilderness Society and other groups are focusing on places that are high value candidates for wilderness status, and it's part of that question. And maybe we need to be I'm not sure if it's a public agency or an NGO, but we need perhaps to think about an initiative to target, what are the remaining valuable matrix lands, across all of the bioregions that we talked about. What does the current landscape look like today? What are the options that we have to deal with in the future? Some of that's been done, but I'm not sure that there's a comprehensive picture. The legacy program sort of tried to do this a while back, and I think some of the bits and pieces are there, but I mean, we need to craft an initiative and anoint someone and have at it. Ruskin.
So I also fully support the larger is better, but I guess I'd also like to speak up a little bit for the small pieces that are left there. For instance, that small fragment that you indicated there in the middle of the urban area, it might lose some of those important natural values, but it's an important part of the green space for that growing city. And I also think when we look up at the redwoods, when you're faced with an ecosystem that has lost 95% of, in a sense, the old growth structure, we've got research that indicates that even an individual old growth tree as part of a large managed landscape has incredible value to it. So I hope in the rush to move towards protecting these large areas that some of the values of these small places don't get left behind.
That was well said, and I meant there was a caveat in that slide that I didn't say, which is we protect land for a lot of different purposes, and so there's community open space and things like that. I think my point is that we need to be cognizant of why we're protecting a place, and if a small fragment is relatively resilient to change, that goes into the argument. That is unlikely to even be the habitat that it's currently being protected for.
I just wanted to add one thing in terms of local county control, because I sit on the Blueprint Committee, which is supposedly statewide, and I work in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley where some of the largest contiguous pieces are still there. And the counties are saying we are independent for land planning and we're going to do what we want to do. And we are going to benefit by building new cities in these very exact types of places that we're realizing that we really have to save. And I don't know that any of us have come up with a way. I mean, I attend all the meetings and I lobby, and we have the California Council of Land Trusts that's working on it, but there doesn't seem to be any policy position in any way to bring some kind of continuity to California state policies. I don't know if anybody has any ideas other than to clap.
Yeah, I certainly don't have the solution. We're faced with the same thing. San Diego County is redoing their general plan right now, and the board is pushing a bad alternative, and it's the blueprint for what's going to play out for decades. And if that vision goes into place and gets realized, we've lost in that part of the county.
Yeah, I really like that question, the two responses. There is a number of things going on. The Nature Conservancy for a long time has established reserve lands or portfolio sites throughout California. Recently, there was a large effort in Southern California through the South Coast Wildlands Initiative, establishing the most important links in Southern California to establishing these relatively large reserves. State Parks is looking at how we're going to ensure our more important parks are linked up with other protected lands. Save the Redwoods League from Oregon down to Monterey County has done their own landscape designs for preserving old growth and old second growth redwood. And there's the NCCP programs that the Department of Fish and Game and the Fish and Wildlife Service are engaged in some of the counties. But there's a lot of good things happening individually, but there is not a collective effort in looking at these together, with the exception of maybe some of those counties where an NCCP is going on, which other factors get involved in there. And I think, with the seriousness of climate change in the next few years, this needs to be an area where collectively we look at the ability to establish these larger landscape reserves and protect the matrix lands as a part of, a major part, maybe the center part of California's conservation efforts. No other questions?
A comment rather than a question. I too am part of this Blueprint Learning Network, and if we take this statewide experience and we bring it to the Bay Area, the way the Bay Area is growing right now is that we've done a fabulous job of protecting the Bay, a fabulous job of protecting a lot of open space in the Bay Area, and people who live here and want to work at jobs here, literally here at UC, and throughout the Bay Area, engage in a process called Drive Until You Qualify. And that means they are buying houses out in the eastern Contra Costa and Solano County and even into the Central Valley. Now, if we take that experience and look at climate change, strategically what the state is doing is growing 25 million people in population in the Central Valley. A place which is very hot is going to take a lot of energy to cool, use a lot of water for those people, and then we are using a lot of energy to drive them back and forth to jobs in the Bay Area. We have a wonderful, naturally air-conditioned climate here in the Bay Area, a great place to accommodate those people at a low carbon footprint. So I keep advising all my environmentalist friends, all of us here who are concerned about protecting the natural landscape in California, that one of the best things we can do is be going to our local city councils and our local planning commission meetings, and whenever there's a project that is calling for a little bit higher density in our neighborhoods, we should be there lobbying to make it a hell of a lot more dense and bigger. And it is very hard for us to do that because we all accept the concept of higher density development, growth being like toothpaste. If you don't put it one place, it'll go someplace else. It's a wonderful concept. And we want California to grow at a higher density everywhere else except the neighborhood we live in.
All right. Mike, thank you very much.